Good evening. This is the Village of Lake Bluff Historic Preservation Commission, our regular meeting of March 11th, 2020. Would you call the roll, please?
Certainly. Member Bergman.
Here.
Member Nickel.
Here.
Member Liebel.
Here.
Member Church is absent. Member Richardson is absent. Chair Kraus.
Here.
We have a quorum.
We have a quorum. Thank you. We have a couple of items on our agenda before we get to our 169 slide presentation. Is that what I heard?
At least.
At least.
A modest presentation.
Okay, the first, I'd like to take items 2, 3, and 4 together. That's the minutes of December 11th, regular meeting, the January 27th special meeting that was very cold, it was held outside, and the January 30th special meeting. They've all been pre-distributed in our packet. I would entertain a motion to approve as presented on all three.
I'll make a motion to approve.
Second?
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Our next agenda item, it's our policy to allow a few minutes of time at the beginning of every meeting for anyone in the audience who would like to address the commission on a subject not on tonight's agenda and within our purview. Is there anyone who would so offer? There is not. Okay, on to the one item that we really have tonight, the presentation of the Village Historic Survey. And even though it looks like there's nobody listening, I talked to probably a dozen people today who are watching on television, so we can all wave to them. Or they'll be watching.
Oh, I'm so glad.
Yes.
Aye.
At least that many.
I don't know where the camera is, but
There's
Best not to think about it.
Yeah.
oh, we won't think of it. That's a good plan.
Just look at us. So, Glenn, do you want to just do a quick briefing, and then we'll turn it over to Susan?
Certainly. So for a considerable period of time, I believe, I don't have it in front of me, but since 1997, perhaps 1998, the village has been engaged periodically in performing surveys of its historic resources. I believe, Susan, you were involved in each of those over the years. So there was originally a study of the camp meeting grounds, the original east side of Lake Bluff. After that, there was a study of the southeast side of Lake Bluff. I believe that was the early 2000s. The estate areas in 2008. And then this product completed the end of 2018, 2019, was really, in essence, to complete the survey. There are a few areas of town that are so new that there's perhaps not a lot to write about quite yet, but for the remainder of town, for the terraces, which now are approaching that 50-year mark as post-World War II developments, for a lot of the smaller subdivisions that occurred to the southeast and west of Sheridan Road, for the industrial areas, that's all been captured in the work that Miss Benjamin and her fine assistants performed with, I think, great attention to detail, and have told really a fascinating and interesting story. I'm going to try not to take too much of your thunder,
That's
Susan,
okay.
but it's,
Thank you.
yeah, the Historic Preservation Society, as it is just starting to turn its focus to post-World War II development, to some of the trends that are really, it sounds like, are in exemplary condition in Lake Bluff, and exemplary examples, I suppose.
My word exactly, exemplary, special.
It's like I read the thing.
Huh?
I guess I did read the thing.
You got I'm sure. This evening marks the culmination of, I think it was a year and a half or so that we spent surveying and thinking about and researching and writing. And it's wonderful to be able to be here and make the presentation. I hope that you will partake in the buffet over here that is straight out of the 50s from, I hate to tell you, but it's our stuff. So, and more of that because I lived it. It wasn't a matter of history. Our presentation is going to be in 3 parts. The first part will be an overview of the survey work that Jean headed up, and Andrew Elders, who is here tonight, helped her with. But Jean drove the car around the streets and meeting and greeting and gathering information. Gwen Summerjant will talk about the developmental history of Lake Bluff. And what we did was we placed the recent survey research and architectural analysis in the historical evolution of the village. so that it isn't just about what we were doing, but where it fits into the local history. And finally, I will talk about how Lake Bluff fits into the national context, what was happening after World War II. And it's really a pretty fascinating story, and what we gleaned from all this is that Lake Bluff was very much a part of the zeitgeist of the period. And here's the word, Lake Bluff was doing a more exemplary and comprehensive approach than some areas that were being developed. And I looked around Highland Park and Wilmette, and I knew Northbrook and so on, but
So you're saying we're better than them?
I'm saying this is better, yes, and intact, a lot of it. So the story is rich, and with that, I will introduce Jean, who will tell you about her experiences surveying.
Thank you.
Good evening. So as Susan said, for those of you who I have never met before, my name is Jean Sylvester, and I conducted the survey along with Andrew Elders, who helped survey Tangley Oaks and the east side remainder. As you know, we were asked to survey those areas of Lake Bluff that had not been surveyed yet, with a special eye toward the mid-century or recent past buildings. Which we did, which are essentially buildings post-World War II through the 1970s. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the process of what we decided to do, how we just approached the survey, and then what ended up happening. The village asked us to perform two different types of surveys, an intensive survey of these areas, and then a windshield survey of the other areas. So the intensive surveys included the larger older neighborhoods and the public structures for a total of 828 buildings, and then the windshield survey areas of really the newer developments. And Gwen will show you how all of these areas were developed, subdivided, re-subdivided, which will make a whole lot more sense after you see all of these pictures. The windshield surveys were a total of 522 buildings. Intensive surveying included me pulling up to the building, getting out of the car, and observing and documenting all of the details, noting defining characteristics, any changes that were obvious from the right-of-way, then completing a survey spreadsheet using Excel, photographing each building, and then uploading those images to the Google Drive. Windshield surveying was much quicker. I just entered addresses directly into the Excel spreadsheet, photographed each building, and uploaded them to Google Drives. If we were able to figure out the models in those areas, we performed intensive surveying on those buildings. So Glenn gave me 37 historic preservation survey maps, which were my Bible during this. As you can see, they were very, very detailed. You can actually see the building footprint. You could see roads. You could see addresses. Extremely helpful. And then, of course, they were color coordinated for the two different types of surveys. The spreadsheet ended up being 51 rows of information, which incidentally provided you with a lot more information than are usually on standard surveys. So we included identifying information, significant features, details, then the big ones, condition changes, and integrity. Identifying information included addresses, shape or plan of the building, architectural types and styles. Significant features were something that was outstanding about the building or really jumped out about it. Details were very, very specific about building fundamentals, the foundation, the roof, windows, dormers, that type of thing. And then the condition was the current state of the building. For certain buildings, it was very clear if windows had been changed, for example. Others, it was really not so clear. There were buildings in the terraces that had the original windows and sliding windows with screens. Others, depending on the light, depending on the weather, we really couldn't tell. But if I was able to tell, I documented it. After we did some research, then we made determinations about significance or contributing. So this is just a quick screenshot of the spreadsheet. It's probably 1/3 of the spreadsheet horizontally, and it's 1/10 of it vertically. it ended up being about 1,360 buildings that were documented. And like I said, there are 51 columns for each building.
Question, if I may? For another project, I'm looking at some of the older surveys that have been done, and there is a challenge now and then with linking a photograph to an address. Does this spreadsheet contain an identifier for the photographs, or?
So how we set this up was we set up the columns by area, then the number, direction, street address, lane, road. And then what I did, and so all of this information the village can take and throw into a program which will do it. I originally tried to include photographs in the spreadsheet, but very quickly the document became way too big and we weren't able to do it. So what I did was I set up a Google Drive for photographs, and I divided them by street. So there were 78 streets, 78 folders of photographs. This is not interactive, but I could pull it up if you wanted. But for example, if we clicked on Lincoln Avenue, this is what you would see, and it is tagged by address.
Okay.
Ruskin Arc, I believe, is what your village uses, and they will be able to put these together for you. So as you can see, actually this is one of my favorite streets. The neighbors were so friendly. People followed me down the street. They were calling their neighbors to come out and talk. I thought they were going to throw a block party for me. But I was out there in all kinds of weather and saw Halloween decorations, Christmas decorations, political signs. And yes, I was out in the polar vortex. But so the pictures are varied, but that's the nature of surveying. So this is Gwen's chart, and she will explain this in more detail. But this shows the survey areas and when they were first subdivided and recorded, and then when they were later subdivided. So as you can see, Arbor Drive, for example, with the exception of the estate buildings that were earlier, is a pretty consistent neighborhood, this Lakewood Estates. But compare that to East Side Remainder, which was, originally the Close farmstead. The number of subdivisions and re-subdivisions allowed for newer buildings to be developed during those time periods. So the East Side Remainder is not a cohesive neighborhood at all when it comes to architectural styles or types or dates of construction.
That's what we like about it, I think.
There's a lot of variety. Campbell Woods, for example, 1987. And as a result, it's a much smaller neighborhood, of course, but it's also much more cohesive. And here's the last. Also, as Gwen will explain, some of these neighborhoods may have been subdivided at a certain point, but buildings were not built because of economic conditions until much later. And the terraces is a very good example of that, which is where I started. And this was a quote on the brochure from Chicago Construction, and I absolutely love this quote because it really set up what I believe they felt about Lake Bluff and how they wanted to sell it. And I have to say, after the survey, I completely agree with this, and I would move in a minute. It's charming, and it's quaint, and it's just lovely. So I started in the terraces because it was really one of the more dense areas, and since we were focusing on mid-century and recent past, I wanted to start in here. Over 20 streets were surveyed, 325 buildings were surveyed in the combined terrace development. The North Terrace is very, very clear that it's a much earlier neighborhood than, say, the West Terrace, for example. This is Chicago Construction and Harold Friedman. They were one of the developers who moved into Lake Bluff during the 60s. Harold Friedman, as you probably have read in the report, formed the Chicago Construction Company in 1934, and after he worked in Chicago for a while, started to concentrate on the North Shore, and he wanted to build for the rising young and professional group, which I love. So he started in Glencoe and then moved throughout New York. Throughout the North Shore. This is him showing a model of a development in Arlington Heights. After he sort of finished on the North Shore, then he moved west to places like Arlington Heights and Buffalo Grove. The original Lake Bluff sales office is located at 515 Green Bay Road in the East Terrace. The area behind the building was used as a parking lot, and model homes were built along West Terrace Avenue. This is the original sales brochure, and if you see this area here for the proposed plan really ended up being what they built. The brochure started out with the ranch homes, which were affordable and were great housing for young GIs, as Susan will explain, who returned from the war, who wanted to build their first homes. Common characteristics of all of the ranch homes were that they were one-story, low-slung brick buildings, but there were several varieties. What's distinctive about this Bel Air model is this double gable here, which actually is quite distinctive, and Virginia McAllister in her style guide said that you don't see double gables very much in ranch houses, and there are several examples of these. Also, this punctuated brick detail here is in this model is on the garage. Several people have filled that in. In other models, it's over here, but it's another distinguishing feature. The bark clay, of which there are many, is distinguished by this split side gable here. And then it's a little bit of a larger porch with two posts. The rancher, again, has that little window and just a simple sort of cross gable. This is one of the more distinctive ones, which just screams 60s to me, which is the Royale. This is distinguished by a hipped roof. The others were side gable roofs. And then this decorative concrete brick inset wall, and then this wall here. And very common changes to these ranches are people change the porch, they change the doors, they would remove some of the punctuated brick windows, and some of them have added additions to the rear, which are not visible to the right of way, which actually don't really disturb the integrity if they're done well and they're not visible. So then we move to the colonials. Distinguishing features of these, all of the two stories had brick on the first floor and siding on the second floor. This is one of the bigger ones of 4 bedrooms called the Madison. This home, incidentally, at 206 Witchwood Lane, which is in the East Terrace, appears to be a pristine example, perfectly intact from when it was built. It still has the original sliding windows with screens, still has this very distinctive window box. These brackets are original with these posts, this large divided window with a little bit of trim underneath it, and then, of course, the one-car garage. There are a few of these, but none are as perfectly intact as this one. The Special Madison was a bigger version of the Madison and included a 2-car garage. The interior is also a little bit bigger, but for my purposes, the distinguishing factor was the 2-car garage. Then we come to the Monroe, which is distinguished from the Madison by its hipped roof, and then a little bit of a bigger porch. Because it extends from the garage, it almost gives the front of the building an asymmetrical feel. And then, of course, the bigger Special Monroe, which is just like the Monroe, but with a bigger footprint and bigger interior, and then the 2-car garage. Chicago Construction also offered smaller colonials that were 3 bedrooms. And of course, all of these names are very patriotic and very colonial revival and, echoing what was happening in the United States after the war. This is the Jefferson, which has, all of the 2 stories have some type of large picture window. This one has the 2, I believe, casement windows on either side, but it has 4 windows across the front. The Jamestown is smaller. It has only 2 windows across the front and a much smaller front porch, and it has decorative iron supports. But again, there's the picture window, there's the brick on the first floor, there's the siding. The Johnstown is another example of a 3-bedroom with 4 windows across. It has this very distinctive projecting cross gable 1-car garage, and then it has an unsupported small porch over the front door. Here's a Chesapeake. Very, very, very few of these are still in existence if they were built. This shows a very small gable over this breezeway This here was either not built or was removed, but this has a very small, sort of narrow porch roof supported by brackets. And that's the distinguishing feature of that. Here's a Jackson. Again, 2 windows upstairs, so a very small house with a large picture window. These columns have been replaced, but otherwise, it's a pretty good example of the Jackson. And finally is the Stanhope, which I don't know how the Stanhope fits in with the Colonial Revival names, but maybe I don't know. But the distinctive feature of this is this arched porchway over the front. This, of course, is a replacement garage door, but common changes to these buildings, of course, are replacing windows, replacing the garage and front doors, changing the porches and the supports for the porches, and then occasionally they will have, some of them had a decorative vent here. Those were taken out when the buildings were resided, and sometimes people added a window on the second floor. So the West Terrace, we believe, is quite a cohesive area. It's very dense, and the buildings there, while there have been tear downs and infill, there's a very concentrated group of these Chicago construction buildings and other buildings that may have been built during the same time period or soon after by other companies that moved in after Chicago Construction Company. So we do believe that that is a potential National Register district. The North Terrace is much older. Well, not much. Well, it is much older because you have, of course, this building from the late 1860s. This building, which we believe is from the when was that, 20s or 40s maybe? And then you have these modern buildings, and then, of course, you have this building, which was just finished in 2018. But as a result, it's much less cohesive than the West Terrace. And then the East Terrace is older than the West Terrace, but not quite as old as the North Terrace. And you have these fabulous modern buildings there. Oh, and by the way, this is a mistake. I put this in because this is Janet's house, but this actually is in the West Terrace, so that was my mistake. But the East Terrace has some pretty great examples of early high-style ranches that you don't see in the West Terrace. So I would say that the East Terrace has more potential individual landmarks than the West Terrace, but the West Terrace is more of a concentrated group. So then we moved up to the East Side remainder, and Andrew joined me in the car. So we surveyed 7 streets and 199 buildings. And as Gwen will tell you, this area dates from the camp meeting grounds and has been divided and subdivided many times, so there's a huge variety of building types and dates of construction here. Beginning with Sheridan Road, there are some commercial buildings, rental buildings. These were apartments. I was very surprised to see these. And then you have buildings from all different time periods, including this building, which was late 1860s. This building was, I believe, 1930s, maybe 40s, 50s, and then very, very, very recent. I'm sorry, this was not 50s. This was probably 60s or 70s, and then this was very recent. So there's a huge range there. This is 233 East Woodland Avenue, which is extremely interesting to me because Washington Avenue, which runs behind Woodland Avenue, acts almost like an alley to Woodland. And I came upon this, which really jumped out at me as looking like this. So I think that this garage might have been a cottage from the camp meeting.
No,
No? We're wrong?
I live across the street from
You
that
do?
house, yeah.
So what is this?
The architect that owned the house fronting on Woodland started using his own property as a hobby. And he built addition after addition after addition onto the house, and every one of them is different. And it's sort of whatever the spirit moved him that day came out of his pencil. And so
So this is new?
the house has been remodeled, and this is all done in the time that I've been in the house. I've been in my house for 30 years. That house evolved over 20 years, all from the 1990s or so.
This one?
Yeah,
But this
right.
garage is also new?
Right, that garage, that's brand new, okay?
You're kidding?
So, but the little colonial front, if you flip back to the other one, the little colonial front, that dates from, I think, the very late 1940s. It's part of, there's a couple of houses along the street that all fit into that mode. And so that forms this little colonial spot. But if you look at the connector between that building and this garage, that's in yet a different style.
Yes, I did notice that. There were quite a few, but you definitely fooled me, because look at, I mean, that's pretty amazing.
Right, well, and the architect flew a different flag every day on his
Oh.
flagpole. Every college,
Excellent.
he flew all sorts of nation flags. He was just a wonderful eclectic guy to have as a neighbor.
Well, tell him you fooled us. So the next area was the Bath and Tennis Club, which was, from the 1950s, which had that wonderful club designed by I.W. Colburn. In this section here is the Boardman area, which was a little bit later than these houses. These houses are very large, on very large lots, and there are very, very big trees there. Stylistically, they're different, so I wouldn't say it's quite as cohesive as a neighborhood as others. But it is a lovely neighborhood, and Boardman is definitely cohesive, but there's a very small number of houses there. Southeast remainder area was a very interesting place for me to survey, because of course you have the very large homes here, which is Sheridan Road, and then you have a lot of buildings from different time periods here, and then this is Indian Hill Road, which is a very small area with houses like this in there, much later. This is the range of houses on Sheridan Road from, from the late, probably 50s, 60s, with this great brickwork and windows, to this, which is extremely recent. There's no cohesiveness to this area whatsoever. So we also surveyed 8 public structures, which were all over the village, starting up here on Blodgett to down here, all very, very different. This is the Central Lake County Joint Water Agency intake pumping station, a beautiful example of, postmodern work where it actually was quite lovely to see. And then you have this brutalist water treatment plant on the southwest side of the village. Here's the old Commonwealth Edison electric substation. It used to be called Johnson Door, and now it's the Canals Motors Auto Park, a couple of schools, and the Public Works facility. And last but not least, Mariani Landscaping, designed by Robert Mariani himself. Then we moved up to Tangley Oaks, which was a development in the late 80s, and Gwen will tell you all about that, which is a fabulous example of what planning can do, even in a brand new development. This was the first of the windshield survey areas, so this went much quicker. The challenge with Tangley was there were 5 models originally. Then things changed, and they made derivations of these models, and then they made different derivations of the original derivations. So they called them elevations. There's a Devonshire 1 through maybe 5, I don't know. And then these are different elevations of all of those. And then there were Covingtons. So Andrew and I tried to document the original models. Otherwise, the rest of them were just photographed and entered in the spreadsheet. Oak Ridge Court, a small area near Tangley Oaks, much smaller, much more cohesive, and double houses here. This is what these look like. Armour Woods, again, carved out of an area near Tangley with double houses, much more modest than Tangley and even more modest than the Oak Ridge. These are double houses, by the way, and I only photographed half of them, so this is the address for 61. 63 is over here. Very cohesive, very modest. So Campbell Court is a very, very small area of just one street in the late 1980s. We did find the model advertised in a newspaper, which was a little bit grander than the buildings that were ultimately built. So this was intensively surveyed, and these were just included as in the windshield surveys. But they're sort of colonial revival, vernacular, but nice buildings. Signet Courts, again, a very, very small area. First developed in the 60s and then later in the 90s. So you have a large variety of buildings in that small neighborhood, leading to really no cohesiveness whatsoever in there. Thorn Valley, again, 1957, 1985. Very little cohesiveness and very large lots, but didn't quite exhibit the planning that was so well displayed in some of the other neighborhoods. Wimbledon Court, late 80s, very modest houses, very similar to the Chicago construction colonial revival houses from the late 60s. And then we go up to Arbor Drive, which was completely different. This is where the Lester Armor House is. So these lots are very, very big, and these houses are very, very big, most of which I was not able to photograph. The woman who lives here, the woman who lives in this house told me that this was the coach house for the Lester Armor House. I'm not sure if that's true, but it is a beautiful house, and this area is gorgeous, but because of the different construction dates, there really is not much cohesiveness there. This is the house that was just sold, I think, last week or early this week. And then we come to the Sanctuary, which is a very new development, very dense, small lots and small houses, and a lot of them. Then we come to Belforet, which is a pretty interesting neighborhood. It's across the street from Tangley, and it was inspired by Tangley in terms of the large lots, the large houses, the neo-traditional style of houses, and planning the development to work within the environment, which meant they're relatively, it's a kind of a winding road, fit in beautifully with the landscape there, the beautiful, beautiful trees, but the builders were different for every house, and so there really isn't, while they are lovely houses, and they're beautifully situated in each lot, there really isn't much cohesiveness except for the period of construction. Blair Park was one of the more interesting neighborhoods also. This is the golf course. This is the little house on 2 Eva Terrace, which is the last house, I believe, that's here. So you have these houses along Green Bay, and then you have this stretch, and this is the new school. We have this house, which people say is the original Hoffman farmhouse. We were not able to confirm that, but the house has been extensively modified. But then we also have a house that looks very much like a Chicago construction house. I don't know if it was, in fact. Janet did not remember, but it sure looks like one. And then we have these kinds of houses from the late 80s, I believe, on Green Bay. And I will conclude and introduce Gwen by saying it was really just a pleasure to do this survey. I loved it. I loved pulling up to each house or walking down the sidewalk to see a new house and see what was there. Everything was just gorgeous. The people were so unbelievably friendly and welcoming, and the village staff could not have been more supportive to all of us. So thank you very much for the opportunity. If you have any questions, Gwen and Susan and I will be here when we're all finished. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. So Jean has just told you the what, and I will tell you the why. And before I start, I have to underscore, Jean, you have an absolutely wonderful staff who's been so, so helpful for this entire process, as have you, Steve, and Paul, and love to get to know the rest of you. So this is, I'll be speaking about the developmental history. Obviously, the survey was very large, geographically, north, south, east, west, and numerically. So you can see from the table, we had a lot of different survey areas, individual sites, and then obviously thousands of individual structures. It's also broad historically. So among these structures,
We have, the structures date from the earliest house that's still extant on Mormon Avenue, 666 Mormon, all the way to the newest planned residential development at the western fringe of the village. Thus, this developmental history was really an essential tool to enable us to understand the chronology and the background of the different areas and assess which resources were significant both as individuals and as groups. So the developmental history is broken into 6 different periods. They're color-coded, so when we go through them, you can keep track of which period we're in. So there's the Pioneer Homestead period that goes up to 1865, the post-Civil War to camp meeting that goes to 1895, the early incorporation years of the village goes to the 1920s, the 1920s to World War II, 1945 to 1975, this post-World War II suburban expansion, and the last period is 1975 to 2019, this large-scale growth management and adaptation. I am not going to summarize everything that was written in the 100 pages of the developmental history, though the detail really is interesting, and I hope everybody will have a chance to read it. So I'll really be hitting the big takeaways. So in this Pioneer Homestead period, there's 3 important takeaways. The first is this Pioneers period sets up the basic geographic structure of the village. So the Green Bay Trail becomes a vertical divider. It's an angled early trade route that attracts farms, so large-scale pieces of property. The Skokie, again, is another vertical divider, this formidable wetland at the western edge of the village. And both of these shape the 19th and 20th centuries for large areas of development. So for example, the arrow points to Blair Park. Both of these, shaped the history of Blair Park, which is a especially convoluted but interesting story. With the coming of the railroad, this is the second big development during this period, 20 years later, and with coming of the railroad, again, another vertical divider is introduced in the railroad, and this shifts the focus of development from west of the railroad tracks to really east of the railroad tracks. A station is established that leads to the creation of the first subdivision. And this first subdivision, of course, is the east end of our survey area of North Terrace. It also leads to the construction of Rockland Road, which is, again, another important geographic delineator. The third important takeaway in this period is along the railroad, it becomes a magnet for speculation. And in the early years, that this attracts land sales, and the guys who get there first is, for the most part, the railroad executives that buy large tracts of land. So this is just a small area of the large area around the railroad tracks, but the tracks that are underlined in yellow are just the ones that were the property of the railroad president, Walter Gurnee, and he titled them in the name of his father-in-law, Matthew Cole. So Walter Gurnee is one of the most important of these speculators. He's the president of the railroad, and he, very importantly, has this defining vision for the community, that this Lake Bluff, Rockland at that time, would become one of a string of high-end residential suburbs. And he's already started to make that happen, building the railroad, but also buying lots of property in Glencoe and Winnetka and Highland Park. And he is connected to the next visionary, in the next period, who's Solomon Thatcher, that buys some of that land, some of Coe's land, the one with the thicker yellow line, which becomes part of Camp Meeting Association. Down, there's an angled line, S.F. Miller, he's the superintendent of the railroad, another one of those railroad executives. And his land will become part of the future location of Lake Bluff Middle School. The next period of development, there are two important takeaways. The first is that the railroad properties turn over, and many of these properties turn over to immigrants, and it's their descendants that sell the acreage, this farm acreage, for subdivisions after World War II. So, for example, the German Henry Hoffman bought some Gurney land for a farm in 1877. His son will sell it for the ill-fated Green Bay Road Highlands subdivision, the 1920s that we'll talk about. And the failure of this subdivision opens the way for today's Blair Park and Public Works survey areas. Also, the Englishman Edmund Maughman buys the first subdivision, land west of it, and it's his son that sells that land west for the Knollwood Heights subdivision, which is part of our North Terrace survey area. It's also during this period, because the schools figure into the survey so prominently, it's important to mention that the first school is very near the location of that, of the railroad station, and it really is serving a population east of the railroad tracks, where population is concentrated until the next period. Until later in this period. So the second big takeaway of this 1865 to 1895 period is the establishment of the Camp Meeting Association. With the Camp Meeting Association, it shifts development from west of the railroad tracks to east. And it, because of its civic functions, development functions, really brings Lake Bluff to the brink of being a suburban village. So Solomon Thatcher's purchase and development of Gurney and Close land in the mid-1870s triggers Lake Bluff's first construction boom. And the Camp Meeting Association is really is the first foray into large tract land planning by a private developer. The Meeting Association puts in streets and lots and parks and water, amenities and housing. And importantly, it sets a seminal standard of quality, not only for architecture, but this very deep-seated value of preserving natural beauty. The next period is this period of early incorporation. It's a period in which Gurney's mid-19th century vision of a railroad suburb begins to materialize in the new century. So on the right, you see Lake Bluff is incorporated in 1895, and it's superimposed on the present-day map of Lake Bluff, so you know exactly where the boundaries were. The Lake Bluff Camp Meeting Association dissolves in 1906. The 1893 World's Fair, that had happened 2 years before, set new standards for what modern living should be. So they set the standard that's rather far above that of the Camp Meeting Association for efficiency, comfort, sanitation, and beauty. The 1893 World's Fair launches the City Beautiful movement, and Lake Bluff is totally on board. By 1914, Lake Bluff is calling itself the Village Beautiful. And in addition to investing in modern infrastructure, like a new water system, sewer system, gas system, important for our survey, the new little village builds a new brick school in 1895.
Gwen?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, I hate to interrupt, but could you go back and just for emphasis, could you just read a couple of those? This, I think, is one of the most astounding little
It is.
inclusions.
It's amazing. Glenn, you love it. Pick and choose the ones you like best.
Sure. Well, a few reasons you might move to Lake Bluff. Automobile livery service throughout the village, low rates. No floating debt, enough cash on hand to pay for 12 months of expenses. Wildflowers, tar surface streets, cement sidewalks.
Read
What a
number-
place.
Read number 6.
Number 6, wildflowers, shrubs, and bushes being planted throughout park system, restoring Lake Bluff to former condition of beauty and marking it as distinct from other North Shore towns. Flowers, birds, and animals protected by law. What a place.
And there's so much more to come. This is just the beginning.
We've been Lake Bluff boosters for a long time.
Oh, yeah. And with reason, and with good reason. So the village, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but this commitment to planning is something that really distinguishes Lake Bluff and accounts for a lot of why it is so beautiful and was so beautiful and remains so beautiful. So the new little village builds this new brick school in 1895. Significantly, it is east of the railroad tracks where development has migrated. It's just south of that Camp Meeting Association where the bulk of the populace lives. And it very much reinforces this shift east of the railroad tracks. And it's important for our survey because its location is part of the Lake Bluff Middle School individual site. So transportation upgrades like a new train station, the coming of the electric railroad, and the construction of Sheridan Road facilitates another development relevant to our study, and that's the estate period of the late 19th and the first third of the 20th century. And the estate district is reflected in our Tangley Oaks survey area and our Arbor Drive survey area. Next period, 1920 to World War II, planning, speculation, and depression. Really interesting. Two important takeaways from this period. The first is to underscore what I just said. An excellent foundation for planning the future of the village is laid down in these years. Like the other North Shore villages, Lake Bluff was inspired by the 1909 plan of Chicago and began to plan in anticipation of a post-World War II building boom. Very wisely, they hired a highly trained and skilled planner, Jacob Crane. And as part of the plan, his text asks, what then should be the aim of the Lake Bluff Plan? Well, with the new Lake Bluff Plan Commission, they produce a remarkable plan and answer that question in 1924. And this plan really lays the foundation for development over the next half century. It is a truly remarkable document. It emphasized two things. First is it emphasizes thoughtful planning. The plan said it should, of course, plan for convenience and adequacy in community development, and it should also seek to lay out the various features so that they will be right the first time and will not have to be replaced. The second emphasis is, most important, it should preserve and enhance the natural beauty of Lake Forest, the quiet, unpretentious charm of this village by the lake. And these are values that keep getting repeated in every subsequent plan. And I think values that are still strongly held today. And also these plans are echoed in the recommendations of our survey. So out of this planning comes the first zoning ordinance that was enacted, which fostered orderly development. And this was after compiling prodigious data. So you can see the zoning map and you can see the present uses map. A building code came out of this planning exercise, and a subdivision ordinance which was passed, which was really very, very important for the next two periods of development. So new subdivisions, for example, were encouraged to have winding streets and large lots. The report was comprehensive and it was prescient. So here you can see, for example, it's out of this report where we get the parkland along Sheridan Road. But the plan forecasts the location of Blair Park as a golf course and a park along the Skokie. And it even anticipates, and this is so remarkable, it anticipates Jawa having a water supply from Lake Michigan with a central pumping station for a group of communities. It also discussed thoughtful expansion through annexation. The second takeaway from this, the other takeaway from this period is that they were very right to be concerned and plan because speculative fever did hit and created major subdivisions. But most, as Jean alluded to, most of these subdivisions were not built out until the following period. So there are 5 new subdivisions in the 1920s, and all of them are part of our survey project. The first is Forest Home. You can see it's part of the East Side remainder. This is the smallest subdivision, and it is probably the only, if not one of the few, that experienced some construction in the period. Red Harlan, for example, built homes here, which Susan will talk about. The second one was Goldman's.
Go back.
Sure.
I've seen this before, and I've always wondered, what's the blank area there?
I don't know.
Was that the remainder of the old brickyard?
That's closed land.
Yeah, okay. the
So it was
closed-
unsubdivided.
The closed land wasn't
Yeah.
part of that.
The next is Goldman's Green Bay Road Highlands, and its failure led to Blair Park and Public Works. This had an extremely interesting plan with not only homes, but apartments and a Market Square-like arrangement on the western edge. And this was being subdivided during the planning, this is the time of the planning, and the 1924 plan especially lauds this Market Square piece of the development. However, this was doomed by chicanery, which you can read about in the document, which is fun reading. Fun but sad. The next is Knollwood Heights, which is just east of that, of the original subdivision. It's part of our North Terrace study area. This was originally Mormon land, and these pictures allow you to see how little was there or that was built in both the Knollwood Heights section and the Rockland subdivision, all part of our North Terrace survey area. Second last development is H.O. Stone's Terrace. This was a very large subdivision and encompasses both our East and West Terrace study areas. It straddled west beyond the village limits all the way to the Skokie. It was originally Leander McCormick land, which was subdivided by the silk stocking real estate firm of the H.O. Stone Company that traced its route all the way back to Pioneer, Chicago. Its failure is fascinating, a classic tale of 1920s boom, bust, fraud, and greed. The last is Ravine Forest, which is actually the earliest of the subdivisions. It's the farther south. It is the very southern part of Ravine Forest is our southeast remainder study area. It's a beautiful subdivision with winding streets that respects the exceptionally beautiful topography. It's adjacent to these lakes. And while this was being subdivided, Sheridan Road was cut across the south end during the initial subdivision. And this also was referenced in the 1924 village plan, and it's cited as one of the accomplishments to date. And the report says they secured rearrangement of the Lowenmeyer subdivision. Lowenmeyer was the developer, so as to better meet the village requirements and to leave parks along Sheridan Road. This brings us to post-World War II suburban development, 1945 to 1975. Again, in anticipation of major post-World War growth, the village very prudently planned. They enacted a zoning ordinance to ward off urban density, and subdivisions like Goldman's had very, very small lots. They also enacted, very wisely, a look-alike ordinance to prevent architectural monotony in these very large-scale subdivisions. Population growth in this period was concentrated in the terraces along Green Bay Road. And these were the developments from the 1920s. The North Terrace, which was Knollwood Heights and the original Rockland subdivision, was built out in the early 1950s by independent builders like Harland. The East Terrace, which is part of the H.O. Stone development, was built out in about 1958 by various builders. The West Terrace was also part of that H.O. Stone subdivision, but it was different from the North and the East Terraces. This is an aerial from 1961. You can see that the North and East Terrace are already built out, and the West Terrace is pretty much a blank slate. It was zoned for larger lots, And it was different in that it was developed by, it was the vision of, mostly the vision of one developer, Chicago Construction, that Gene alluded to. Friedman was savvy. By this time, he had a track record on the North Shore. He knew who his market was and what they wanted. And this is a very interesting article from 1960, the Trib of 1960. This is just when the West Terrace is being built out. And as Gene alluded to, he had something called the Friedman formula, which zeroed in on executives. And the article states, these selective buyers want a home in a prestige location. This is Friedman giving an interview. In a prestige location with at least 2,000 square feet of living space, 3 or 4 bedrooms, separate dining room, basement, 2-car garage, and a minimum of 2.5 paths, priced between $30,000 and $35,000. Look at the broadside, that Chicago Construction, there it is. That's the price range, those are the houses. And Friedman says in this interview, we came to know our chosen market well and became particularly sensitive to the style trends and to design features which were to affect it. And this is very much seen in the succession of styles that Gene talked about. So in addition to the Friedman formula, the non-monotony ordinance resulted in quite a plethora of different types. Friedman was known for its quality construction, and perhaps that is why this area is so intact and evocative of mid-century. The terraces, the 3 terraces, the terrace area in general is an extremely important period in Lake Bluff's development at mid-century in terms of scale, in terms of its impact of population, in terms of architecture. And Susan will be talking about why this area alone, as Gene had set up, is among the terraces, is the most apt candidate for a potential historic district. And regarding the boundaries of where a district were and the boundaries of this Wispy Terrace development, you'll remember in the H.O. Stone development of the 1920s, the subdivision went all the way to the Skokie. The west end was never developed. Early on, that area was purchased by the village. This many people in this small an area of the terraces, the village very much knew that existing schools and municipal features couldn't accommodate these people. And so until about the 1980s, it was contemplated for various uses, such as a school or a parkland for the new residents. But as I'll talk about in the next period, in the 1980s, planning would begin at that western edge of West Terrace to be the site of a major component of the new regional water system. And so this area is in the survey, the Jawa water treatment plant survey area. Blair Park comes into existence during this period. The density of that original Goldman subdivision, floodplain concerns, and other concerns led to most of the land that was in this Goldman's Green Bay Road Highlands, plus a Wacker land, the land from the Wacker estate that was a little farther north, became recreational space. A referendum was held, and there's very interesting promotional literature for the referendum at the Historical Society. A referendum was held in '62, and the golf course opened in '68. The buildings and the pools that are now part of Blair Park date from 1973 to 2004. Regarding subdivisions and schools in this period, the school district planned as carefully as the village and the park district, beginning with the hire of the first superintendent in 1943. So in 1966, Central Elementary School was built in order to educate all those young children that were moving into the terraces. Lake Bluff Middle School was built in 1950. As far as subdivisions go, Thorn Valley on the left was actually subdivided by the architect of the Lake Bluff Middle School, Howard West. It was originally subdivided in 1957 and then with an addition in 1985. Signey Court, up at the top of the screen, was originally subdivided as Green Bay Acres in 1961. It was re-subdivided in the 80s, and it was annexed to the village in 1969. Bath and Tennis, at the very southern end of the village, tapped into a new family lifestyle concept of the late 50s, early 60s, and this was the Bath and Tennis Club. It was on former Thompson estate land, and a absolutely fantastic modern-style sports and residential complex was built here, designed by the socially prominent Lake Forest architect I.W. Coburn. There's also an industrial component to our survey that dates from this post-war period. So post-war planning included the creation of an industrial district in 1958. The district was along the highway and the railroad, and it pushed out the western border of the village. And this was created in order to increase the village's tax base, but it was also to manage industrial encroachment. Of course, Waukegan is just north of here. Remnants of this industrial area in our survey area are the Johnson Door complex from 1960. And we were able to figure out when this complex dated from with historic aerials. And if you see there was nothing here in 1947. The leftmost aerial is from 1961, and you'll see that original building has a tie both to the expressway and to the railroad, which borders it. And it was used by a succession of companies. The other remnant, it was extensively remodeled in 2000, and so its integrity is not high. The other industrial building that dates from this period is the Marion Landscape individual site. It's a very similar story to Johnson Door. It begins with the Richard and Son stone contractors in the 1960s, and again, we were able to date when it was built and its succession of alterations through these large aerials. Last period, 1970 to 2019, large-scale growth management and adaptation. So planning in these years needed to be done because there was very large-scale growth. The village sought to manage this large-scale growth through comprehensive plans in 1971 and 1986, and these very much built on those values established in 1924. The Park District and the schools had to adapt also to this incoming population. And so in the survey areas in this period are public works, which you see on the left. In keeping with the 1971 plan's goal to improve public buildings, the existing landfill was the site of a new public works complex. So the plan on the left is a site plan of the new public works building in 1983. The plan on the right is the second building that was built in 2002. Regarding schools during this period, that Lake Bluff Middle School that was originally built in '55 was enlarged in '86 and extensively rehabilitated in 2015. Lake Bluff Elementary School was built in 2008. And in the developmental history, I go through the ups and downs of philosophy of the school district, concentration to neighborhood schools to consolidation. So the Lake Bluff Elementary School is one of those shifts in philosophy from neighborhood schools to consolidation. And the Central Elementary School was demolished. This school was built in 2008. During this period, the remarkable change in water supply was undertaken. So the regional resolve to bring Lake Michigan water really began in '86. But it came to fruition in 1992 with the intake plant. And just to see if everybody is paying attention, does anybody see something wrong with this slide?
Yeah, the water intake is.
Right. This was a trick slide to make sure that you're paying attention. Yes, it's actually on Blodgett.
How did they get up to Shore Acres?
The raw water intake came in 1992. It is actually at the east end of the east side remainder. And the water treatment plant also came in line in 1992, expanded in 1999. Lake Bluff did the heavy lifting of the system in hosting the two major facilities, and they also did the very hard work, and many of you may have been involved in this, of appropriately integrating these facilities architecturally and geographically into their neighborhoods and their sites. And all of this was very carefully laid out in the planning. Plan unit development, planned residential developments are a big factor in this period of development. So in order to preserve the natural and historic character of the building and to ensure the compatibility of this new large-scale development and large plots of land, the village enacted a planned residential ordinance in the early 1970s. And the first test of that ordinance was the Philip D. Armour Estate. The project was actually broken into two parts. It was built over much of the 1980s. Both the Tangley Oaks project and the Armour Woods project, each was done in phases, and these phases were largely geared to price points tolerated during the turbulent 1980s. The project began with that magnificent country house from 1932, built by Philip D. Armour, designed by Harry T. Lindeberg, and it was the headquarters for a book publisher, and it was surrounded by an old-growth forest. The plan residential development for this property was worked out in the late 70s. So there was an enabling ordinance, and then for each plan development, there are these very lengthy tailored ordinances to the project. They're lengthy from a type page standpoint, but also there's graphic exhibits that spell out exactly how everything is going to be built. So this project resulted in the preservation of the estate. A 6-acre buffer was established around the house, and the land was subdivided to sustain the natural and historic qualities of the site. So the loop road around the property respects the historic approach, and the series of cul-de-sacs provided access to each group of homes. And as Jean had said, there were 5 model homes that were on Leeds Court, right at the entry to the estate. The gatehouse, right at the beginning of the estate, became the sales office. And this plan was, it didn't come about without a lot of hard work, but it's really a very thoughtful plan. So this loop road keeps traffic away from the homeowners. So a homeowner actually feels like they live in almost a mini estate surrounded by an old-growth forest. So in each cul-de-sac has a cluster of homes that's kept away from the mainstream auto traffic. Each lot, and you can look closely, you can see each little lot. Each lot has a strip of trees at the back, whose preservation is the responsibility of the individual homeowners. As a whole, 75% of the property was left relatively undisturbed in its present wooded state. Lots averaged about half an acre, and each single-family home had at least one porter on a common open area or a private undeveloped conservation area. Home types were ranches, 1.5-story, 2 stories. There were many different floor plans and a variety of choices for the exterior, and these were rolled out over time with styles and features that followed the trends of the day. And Tangley Oaks was built out in 5 phases. The pictures at the bottom give you this feel of the landscape and how it really is preserved to feel like a wooded estate. And by 1985, the land planner and the general planner had received, especially the land planner, had received numerous awards for land planning and environmental preservation. As Jean alluded to, there was many permutations of the housing varieties. Appropriate to a Tudor estate, they have English-derived names. And interestingly, if you look in the box, the James Company, who was the developer, their approach to the development very much reflects, or is reflective of, or mimics the Chicago construction formula of the previous period. And so at the beginning of the project in 1980, Mr. James says that Tangley Oaks was priced as luxury, but not for the carriage trade. And he elaborated, and this sounds just like Mr. Friedman. You form a very clear picture of your target market, then you need to develop the best product in the price range that will appeal to your intended buyer. He looks back in 1986 at the end of Tangley Oaks and says, talks about the type of resident that purchased in Tangley Oaks. The average age is about 45. They're not quite empty nesters. Most people buying these homes are upper-level executives. Again, that executive formula. If they're not at the top already, they're destined to get there. The sophisticated buyer knows quality. What they are buying is a picturesque setting within walking distance of the train. More than anything else, it's the trees that attract the residents to these particular homes. The economy got to a point where the developer was really pressured to have offerings at a lower price point to be able to close out the project. And so they brought, after significant negotiation, a reasonable density and character harmonious with Tangley Oaks and the village-approved Armour Woods with an amendment to the Tangley Oaks planned residential development. This was a project of 84 townhomes on 29 heavily wooded acres with ponds, mostly targeted to empty nesters. Each building had 2 attached units. There was a conservation area that surrounded most of the site and the buildings. The buildings were a minimum of 30 feet apart. There were 3 floor plans that were offered. This one shows the one plan that has the option of a second floor for an additional bedroom. They were laid out, I think, very sensitively in that the patio and the garden area for each of these attached unit was at opposite ends of the building for privacy. And to make this comfortable for people who were used to owning their own home, this is each owner, even though it's an attached unit, each owner owns his own lot. This spawned other planned residential developments. Belforet was very much inspired by Tangley Oaks. It's right across Green Bay Road. Again, there was careful attention to wooded landscape, architecture, conservation. And this one, just a conservation note, an original, at the far west end where you can see green in the Belforet subdivision, an original slice of prairie was preserved. And this goes all the way back to that first slide, that original piece of that original Skokie Marsh from pioneer days. The other 3 subdivisions that were planned residential developments were all in and around Bath and Tennis. So Wimbledon Courts was a separate development just north of Bath and Tennis. Again, buildings, conservation area, the Carolyn Getz wetland preserve was the conservation component of that. Wimbledon and Boardman was basically the Irish Towers and the modern sports complex. By the late 80s, the concept was old and the buildings were tired, and they were redeveloped. Now, not all subdivisions in this period were planned residential developments. Straight line subdivisions were Campbell Woods from 1987. It is just north of Armour Woods, but it was not by the James Company. It was an independent developer, Bruce Campbell from Lake Forest, who then quickly went on to develop Belforet. The other just straight subdivision was Lakewood Estates, which, as Jean had said, was the 78-acre Lester Armour Estate. It was subdivided in 78. This area had been, around the golf course, had been annexed to the village in the mid-70s. And it started out with this beautiful 1931 David Adler house, which was approached by an arbor. And you can see the arbor in the picture, and you can see that the arbor in that aerial from 1974, that pre-subdivision aerial. And the subdivision sought to at least subdivide it in a way where the arbor and the approach were respected. The last subdivision of this period was the sanctuary, 80 acres that were next to the village, developed in 2 phases with active and passive recreation areas. I'll now turn it over to Susan to wrap it up.
Thank you, Gwen.
Thank you.
It's a long, beautiful story. And I think to understand what we were doing, it was important to look at the big picture and put what was being done after World War II in the context of the development of the village. It is also important that we looked at, I think I need the clicker?
I've shanghaied it.
Standing on one foot. It is also important that we understand the development of Lake Bluff in terms of the big picture, and I explored the North Shore to see what was going on in Wilmette and in Highland Park, and then the suburbs to the west, Deerfield and Northbrook and so on. You have the same kind of subdivision, but that too is a rich and interesting story. It was a time when vets were coming home from the war, and it was an opportunity to live the American dream, even if it is somewhat of a fantasized American dream. If you look at this photo on the left, you see Mom, and who drives carpools and is going to PTA meetings, and she has a lawnmower in her hand, which that kind of befuddled me, because but it does say something about what the woman's responsibilities were. So the vets were getting married, having children, and looking for a safe, comfortable place to raise a family. In the 1950s, the suburb population was up 19 million people. In the cities, it was up 6 million people. And there were people living in the cities. They had nowhere to live. They were living with their parents. And so to enable this to happen, for them to be able to build homes for the 15.7 million returning veterans, there was legislation that was passed prior to that time, but that saw the ability to actually live the dream that families were hoping to live upon returning from the war. Probably the most significant piece of legislation, and there was this huge, as I said, people were living with their families, shortage of homes, was on June 22nd, 1944, FDR signed the Serviceman's Readjustment Act, which has come to be known as the GI Bill. And it provided a lot of things, including loans to start businesses, college tuition, but most important, it allowed for low-interest mortgages. And I'm sorry, isn't so easy to see, but it's in the report. It shows that people in Lake Bluff were getting these mortgages. So that is a document, and I have to do a plug here for the Lead Center, because without the material that is located there, we could not have done this. And without Janet's introduction and Kathy's, we sat down and talked to Kathy for a long time too. I mean, the pieces began like a puzzle. They began to come together, and a picture was formed. Another important piece of this was the Highway Act of 1956, when Eisenhower was president. And it's true that Edens was only built to Lake Cook Road originally as a throughway, but there were thousands of miles, I had written down here how many, but thousands of miles of roads nationally constructed. And beyond that, there was enormous romance with the car. And it was the women that the car manufacturers were looking to sell. Now there is it's hard to see her, but there is a woman back there dressed in an evening gown by this very glam car in turquoise. And if you look at the interiors, that's what the cars look like. And I have to tell you, this experience for me was not historical. I lived it. Yeah, so it was kind of double fun. So Gwen spoke a little bit about the layouts of the communities and the subdivision areas that we were kind of focused on that had never been really assessed before, related to post-World War II construction. And there are really kind of two ways of viewing subdivision, and I'll talk about subdivisions in a minute. But there was the grid that strayed out of Daniel Burnham, but before Daniel Burnham, get into the 18th century and think of Savannah or Brunswick, Georgia, when Oglethorpe was doing his subdividing of those cities. And the more romantic vision of Frederick Law Olmsted in a place in Riverside. So that there is, and especially the more romantic view of subdivision was adopted by developers. Hence, we have Levittown. And I've actually been to Levittown in Long Island because our son lives there. And it's fascinating to see it. You don't have to go far to see a multitude of housing types in a planned community. Go to Park Forest, which was developed in 1947 by Nathan Manilow and Philip Klutznick and Carol Sweet. And what's interesting is that, there is these 17,500 houses were built in Long Island. And it couldn't have happened without standardization and prefabrication that enabled William Levitt to put them up, house after house. Interestingly, the earliest houses were those Cape Cods, feeding on the surge of patriotism that existed after World War II, as it had existed after, all the wars. Colonial architecture never leaves us. It just recycles in different forms, depending on where the country is. Now, look at the houses that were built in 1957 by Levitt, because his housing morphed into somewhat larger houses, somewhat more modern houses, and think about the North Terrace. Now, this document that you can't really see, but it's in the report. I think it's important to look at the plan of North Terrace in relation to this 1936 publication called Planning Neighborhoods for Small Houses. And it was considered the subdivision primer. And if you think of subdivisions as the building blocks of communities, going back forever, but let's just take Chicago, with the bungalows and four squares. I did some work in Maywood. Well, there were subdivisions of all sizes built in the early 1900s. So it is important to think that, the North Terrace, even though it was laid out in the 20s, it really has a wonderful combination from what is this publication of curvilinear streets and straight roads with a rather grand entry. I mean, I think this is, from a planning standpoint, a very interesting kind of a subdivision. So the Levitts were building large scale, but there were thousands, maybe I'm exaggerating, let's say hundreds, but maybe thousands of developers post-World War II doing the same thing like Friedman on a somewhat smaller scale or a somewhat larger scale. And, Hollywood Builders in Wilmette, you could live on Wilshire Boulevard. I mean, it is really kind of a fascinating thing that was happening all over the North Shore. And having driven around Wilmette with Kathy Hussey, who's their director of the museum of the Historical Society there, they did an exhibit on the West Wilmette and the subdivisions. There is still a lot yet to learn. I said to Kathy, tell me about it, and she could tell me quite a lot, but there is a lot to learn. And I think in Lake Bluff, we pulled together a lot of information to underscore the significance of this era of development. And then you look at the houses that were built in North Terrace, in addition to the plan. And we just lucked out again at the Historical Society, Lake Forest, Lake Bluff Historical Society. They had a zillion real estate listings, and no realtor should be allowed to throw those out. I mean, they really need to be gathered and put in an archive here at the museum. I think, and there are some. We looked at some of them that are there. But between what was at Bleat and here, in Lake Forest, Lake Bluff, at that collection, we really got a feel for what these houses were like. And then as their families got bigger and they had a little more money, they moved into larger houses, perhaps the ones that Friedman was designing for Chicago construction. Just to say a little bit about styles, and I think you've heard this all before, but I was fascinated with the fact that not only, were we seeing these permutations and combinations of colonial housing, but lo and behold, we go over to Washington, those apartments. Now, would you think that was an apartment building? I mean, unless some of them have parking in front. But otherwise, I mean, it's a segue into the more residential, single-family neighborhoods, and I think it's really, really quite incredible. So we talked a little bit about colonial architecture recycling, and the prevalent modern architecture, I'm using modern kind of carefully because I don't necessarily mean modern. What was then called contemporary, and I grew up in one. I grew up in a 1950s in Minneapolis, a 50s ranch house, a really nice one. It was $34,000 in 1954, whenever it was built. And it was contemporary. So what does contemporary mean? I mean, that's what they were called. I remember my dad manufactured furniture. So, I kind of not only grew up in it, but I was exposed to the design characteristics of the period because my parents bought early American furniture for the kitchen. The better stuff was in the living room, but it was still Baker and it was the higher end lines. And if you come to my house, which you're all invited to, and you can see the rest of my chrome, what you'll see is a combination of and I'm coming back to this, a combination of my in-laws' porch, which was added in the 50s or 60s, I don't remember, and the breezeway connecting the garage to the main part of the house in my parents' house, which is so characteristic of these contemporary ranch houses. It's fixed reed. I mean, I just remember all this. And guess what color? Turquoise. A hot color then. And lo and behold, my in-laws' room was also turquoise. So I did a sort of a synthesis and have this combo in our porch in back. Okay, so I digressed. But the contemporary houses are, what characterize them? There's very little, if any, colonial. The breeze block that Jean talked about, they're broad overhangs, low slung. Does this sound Frank Lloyd Wright-ish a little bit? Well, Frank Lloyd Wright was very published in House Beautiful, for instance. So you see the influence, even if it isn't high-style stuff. It was called contemporary, corner windows, no historic ornament, broad overhangs to fit in the prairie setting where we all generally live, and this is flat land out here in the west, toward the west, not ravine cut. But it is really interesting that this is kind of the interpretation of modern that was prevalent. There's some high-style stuff, but not very many. So you got more bang for your buck with a split level, because you walk in, downstairs is the rec room, on the main floor, living room, dining area, kitchen, up a level are the bedrooms. Well, some of this had to do, I've read, with sound. I mean, you know, your kids are playing rock and roll, and the parents are losing their mind, and they want to be somewhere else, or maybe they want to go to sleep, or maybe they want to listen to Beethoven, or whatever it is. But this offered some ability for the family to have separate areas and to not actually hear each other either. Not every house was in a subdivision, and Jean and Gwen talked about the Harlans. Well, the first red Harlan built in the 20s, but his sons, Harlan and Harlan, built on scattered sites throughout Lake Bluff, and you know more about this than I do, but, you know, again, this contemporary feel. I mean, these do not look like colonial houses. But Frank Lloyd Wright's influence, I'm constantly amazed at how important he was, even if it's almost subconscious. But in the 1930s, Wright, who had his huge gift for reinventing himself, developed the Usonian house. Inexpensive, natural materials, brick on the street, but glass in the back. And we have to remember that during this period, all the entertainment, people weren't hanging out on their front porches like they were during the Victorian era. They were in back barbecuing and entertaining folks there. So you see the characteristics of the more modern houses, especially in Lake Bluff, that are derived at some level from Frank Lloyd Wright. And this was in the journals too. There was the Modern House in America was published in 1940, and Keck and Keck and Edward Durrell Stone and others were being published. And then I told you about House Beautiful. The editor was in love with Frank Lloyd Wright. So here comes the good part. This, to me, I had more fun sort of thinking about women. Now look at the slide in your upper left. That's Mom with her crown. And notice the kids. Chef Boyardee. I hate to tell you that the V8 is in my refrigerator right as we speak. But yeah, I mean, there's these fast foods, convenient foods that made life, quote, easier. I don't think it was so easy. Mom was very busy, and the romanticization of Mom in the kitchen with her apron and her high heels, you know, and Gwen was telling me that her mom would grandma, it wasn't your mom never would have, I knew your mom, but her grandmother would be dressed like that. And even my mom didn't work. My mom got dressed every morning. She looked pretty close to this, I hate to say. She would dust, she would carpet sweep, she'd volunteer at the hospital. These women were driving carpools, they were active in the garden club. The husbands were off to work, not necessarily commuting from here. They could be at Abbott or somewhere else, but they were off to work. And they held the political office. But Mom was doing lots else. This is, I love this, and I have to tell you this. So this is, I noticed in back of me, the buffet. That was what serving was in the 50s. I would say informal, but look how they were dressed. I mean, the serving was informal, but not the way the men in suits and the women in you know, what can I tell you? A party dress, so to speak. Entertaining was in the back. Look at the glass wall. I mean, that is, architecturally, that's the influence of what was going on in European architecture, the international style. But that's where Dad's barbecuing, and it just cracks me up because, okay, I've been married 50 years. So, you know, my husband thought we bought a house, time to barbecue. Mom prepares, Mom serves, and Mom cleans up. And Dad takes the meat and he puts it on the barbecue that Mom has probably already lit. And, you know, and then gives it back to Mom, who serves it. It took me about,
Most important part.
Flips it.
Dad takes credit for it.
of course, of course.
He's making drinks the whole time, too. And, you know,
Well, it took me about 2 times to figure out that barbecuing was not all it's cracked up to be. Shall we barbecue tonight, dear? Not so sure. Well, anyway, so this was kind of the style of entertaining, and then it was kind of imitative of what was going on TV with Ozzie and Harriet. Now, I wanted to go back to one thing here. This is important. So all the women, you know, they were in the house and so on, but look what happened in the mid-60s. She was a heroine to me, Marlo Thomas. And this show, That Girl with Her Throat, and it, by the way, was in Minneapolis where I grew up. So, you know, she's walking down the street and she throws her hat in the air. I mean, this is, and look at her clothes. I mean, she's one sensational girl who is kind of an inspiration, and I think, and there was a change kind of in TV shows, but that was a marked one. Anyway, so there was TV, and the TV shows were this idyllic family that was romanticized. Now, you didn't want to miss your favorite TV show, so, and you wanted convenience food. Maybe Mom and Dad were out and the sitter was there, and you'd get a TV dinner. I thought it was a huge treat when I got to eat a TV dinner. And of course, we had TV tables. I mean, this is just kind of the way it was, but interesting and fun. So, I digressed a little bit from architecture on this, but that was the life that was lived outside in the way people entertained. Architecturally, they lived in the houses that, you know, we've showed you. The styles changed in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. In the 80s, I think you had the best here with Tangley Oaks. But architecture, the look of architecture changed. If you think about the colonial styles, I call them the neo-styles, but some of them, like at Tangley, were a little more close in scale to the original houses, the colonial revivals. And then anything was fair game. So there were colonial elements that were sort of attached. And, you know, classical architecture was used, but no one kind of tried to be true. I mean, the Parthenon does not have 2 columns. You know, I mean, it's an interpretation, and I'll just whisk through these. Neo-Tudor, same kind of thing. And I just wanted to compare it to like a 20s, you know, Tudor house. Neo-Shingle. Think of the shingle-style houses in Cape Cod and whatever that date from the 1890s. Neo-Prairie even. I mean, these are all popular. And these styles are here so that you can really get Neo-French, mansard. There's no attempt to accommodate during the 70s, 80s period. I mean, you can see French-style houses consumed by their mansard roof. I mean, there's no attempt to be truthful to historic proportions, but they adapt the elements. And then there is something that, what's her name? McAllister calls Millennium Mansions. She kind of loses focus at the end of the book, and then when she's describing styles, and she does it because you can't help but lose focus because there is no focus.
The architects have all lost focus.
That's
They don't know
true.
what they're doing anymore.
That's true.
Paul Bergman always advocating for his father's perfect work.
Well, no, it's good.
Look at those 2 houses.
Yeah, I mean, proportion is kind of out the window. So now this is the wind-up. We We loved it here. We really did. You know, this is, you know, from the time I wrote about Lake Bluff in the North Shore book, and I said, you know, you're winding up Sheridan Road, and then you get to this wonderful little village, and Chicago is not even kind of near here anymore. It's its own place, like a little resort with a character of a comfortable, cozy place to be. And it's even, I think it just keeps getting better with more restaurants. You know, I mean, I think it's, you know, it's a very special place. Unique community on the North Shore, the village atmosphere. These are our conclusions. That needs to be respected and maintained. High quality architecture. You got a job to do if buildings are torn down, and that is a killer for us. I mean, who value the character of our communities with these historic houses, be they historic from the 1860s or the 1960s. I mean, they're part of the richness of the fabric of Lake Bluff. And having now worked on, you know, the whole gamut, you know, from the camp meeting to the estates, it's a pretty special place. And I put in there quite deliberately, is that the Royale? I'm not sure. But it's one of the Friedman Chicago construction houses. You know, it fits into the quality of architecture that characterizes Lake Bluff. So we then felt we had to say, okay, this is what we think, having worked on the survey, having spent a lot of time researching the community at this place you're looking at. And I think it is very important to consider that the survey is a living document. And by that I mean there's stuff we don't know. You know, and there's stuff that you know, and there's stuff to be had and needs to be thought of as a document that should continually be amplified, you know, with new research, new material. And I think it's if you can get this out there as you choose, which I know you can because Glenn's got plans, that, you know, I think it's an opportunity to ask residents. Jean, on the man on the street, so to speak, I mean, she would come home and say, oh my God, I had such a good time. This woman came out and she told me all blah, blah, blah. So, but you did, you know? I did. Yeah, it's great. So this is the time to say, okay, we got all this good information, and you can get it out to them and say, what have you got in your closet, your attic, your basement? You know, that about the realtors, get, you know, what you can from them, and build up the collection, because this is, you know, a great opportunity. Okay, let's talk landmarking, and this is we're struggling here. We made a list of significant buildings. It's a working list, you know, as we, well, should we, you know, what do you think of this, or what do you think of that? This is what, you know, we have gone over and over. I think you should look at the list and think, well, think about the criteria that we used, and, you know, are those the ones? Maybe a lot of them are, maybe some of them aren't. I mean, I think that those Leeds Court, you know, the model houses for Tangley are, I mean, that's like a deal. I mean, I think those are really, really important. I don't think,
Is there more to that list?
no. I mean, do I have more?
Not the models in the terraces?
We really debated long and hard about the models and the terraces, because while they were supposedly centered along, laid out along the center, we heard conflicting things from, some people said the north side were the models, some people said the south side were the models, several of them were modified, so we really did not know what to do. It certainly would open, after more research, if you could establish that, we would definitely recommend that they be significant, but unfortunately Chicago Construction is out of business. We were not able to contact anybody, we were not able to find any archives or any reference material, so we could not establish that those in fact were the original set of models.
Well, at this point, can't you just select the ones that are most in their original format? You talk about the sliding windows and with the original trims on them and whatnot. If they had all of that original.
So you did identify homes within the terraces that you deemed to be significant?
And we even pulled some of them out. Remember, I sent you a letter months ago when we struggled with this very issue. And so, absolutely, I think that is a way to go.
Forgive me for being a bit redundant, but Jeannie, since you didn't have a mic, I just want to make sure it was caught for the tape. Jeannie, you were saying that we weren't 100%, you don't have to come up, but you were saying we weren't 100% sure where the models were in the terraces. And so if you could confirm that, you can confirm which side of Center Avenue they were on or somewhere else.
Right.
It would be appropriate to consider those significant, but more research.
We considered them as contributing to the potential
Okay.
national register district. And as far as a local landmark, we just decided because the sales office at 515 Green Bay was, that was a no-brainer. And that was documented that that's what that was.
And Janet has, by the way, she introduced us to all this. I mean, she launched this, really. And she has some, yeah.
He lived it.
She lived it, yeah.
Thanks.
And so, you know, I would say this is, I think it's a good plan to talk with some of the owners with Janet and who lived it and lived at her house. And her house is on the cover of the report. That is her house.
Susan, could I raise one other?
Could you have one of them?
If only you would do it at the microphone.
You have the two.
The only other issue with significance that we really debated long and hard was the Hoffman Farmhouse. Because we couldn't, well, Gwen said that it was located on certain aerial maps. We couldn't establish for certain that that was the original farmhouse. And the building has been so modified over time that the integrity really is lost. Now, architecturally, it may not be as significant as it would be historically significant, but again, we identified that as a potential local landmark or national register, but not as a significant rated building. So, for those
Something
reasons.
to think about. I mean, you know, the fact that this is a document that is, you know, is meant to grow and change, and you learn more about that building, and then you can nominate it.
And we will soon have access to, we don't have access to that spreadsheet at this point where you have.
I think we haven't, because it's pretty unwieldy,
Right.
we haven't tried to print that out and provide it to you. I think we've sent out a link to that in the past. If not, certainly we can send it again.
Okay.
But long-term, the work would be,
I'm
I hope I'm
sorry.
not mistaken.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. I'm sorry to
Oh,
have interrupted.
yeah. Long-term, the goal would be to take that set of data, integrate it with the set of data we already have from the prior surveys, and
right.
have one combined product in that Lake Bluff line. That's the long-term goal.
Great, thank you, thank you.
But the survey spreadsheet was submitted along with the report.
It was.
If you want to look at all 51 columns times 1,300 buildings, it's there for you to peruse.
Okay.
Tangley Oaks, I don't think that's a local landmark, or the Gatehouse. You know, these are just some other possibilities. Now that we know the truth about those houses,
Up the garage.
and the garage, the ball's in your court, you know.
Right.
But that is the sales office, and I apologize, I could not pull off. I couldn't grasp what Jean had out on the, in wherever it was, Google Drive, so I have this bad shot. But that should be landmarked too. That's another important
Have you
building.
done any research into the Insel, the Insel Powerhouse up there? Do you have any insight into researching the powerhouse itself, or any of the Insel work that's done that's what, about 1905, I guess? When that-
Well, when you think about the electric railroad and it being located where it is, it might be, I bet there's information in those interurban books. I have them, if, take them and look through them when next time we see you. Because that's where I would start. I mean, there's a lot on, like Halliburton and Root, I think it was Root. Halliburton and Root did a lot of powerhouses, but that's like later.
It's different.
But this, I would look in those books on the interurbans, because that, I think, is where you're going to find it. Well, I had to bring this up because, Janet, when we were working on the estates, Janet and I went for a ride. And where's the Philip Mayer house? It was published in the, I don't remember now if it was a Form or the Record, and it's in this book I just finished. So we're giving it exposure, but what a tragedy. I mean, it was, and, oh, no, I can't think of her name, the woman who wrote Motherland, who grew up in, Kathy knows, in Lake Bluff, lived in it. But we didn't know any of that, you know, as we were looking for this house, and the house didn't exist. So I think
It's two nice houses now.
two houses are there. Yeah, I know.
Postmodern
Yeah.
houses of just spectacularly undistinguished architecture.
Yeah, and they replaced this wonderful house. And I can give you a lot more information on it than is just even in that architectural record article, because I did more research. I mean, it's really a pretty fascinating story about the way the house was designed. You never had to, if you didn't want to heat the second floor, you could just live on the first floor. I mean, there was all kind, and the big glass windows are at the back overlooking the lake, and, you know, and this is the glass block at the front, so you have privacy, but you have light. I mean, it's a pretty cool place. Well, you know, I guess that's the urgency of getting some of this out there, because a lot of these places, most of these neighborhoods, you know, are pretty intact. So this is kind of the time to not let this kind of thing happen. Okay, so we thought, now, this is, okay, none of our business, but it would be a great idea if you could revise your ordinance to allow for the designation of historic districts, which means you have to do the groundwork to explain to people that what you're, you know, what you're doing. There have been economic studies by Donovan Ripkema on how property values actually grow in historic districts. And, you know, the definition of an expert is somebody from out of town with a briefcase. And he is that, but he's really a He's done a lot of studies, right. So you can, you know, educational programs, you know, about why it's really quite okay. But I think the fact that Jean was on the street and encountered so many people who were so enthusiastic and who came out, and I mean, it's in the air, and we just sort of finished, you know, in the winter last year, or maybe it was spring. And then you can start, I know Paul's working on the Camp Meeting Association. That's a great start. And then that can segue into, you know, a district of the National Register, of which the West Terrace is, I would bet you is eligible. And there aren't that many historic districts listed on the register from this time period, but they're eligible now, 50-year rule, they're 50 years old. And I've been to Arapahoe Acres in Denver. I think I have some notes on it, but it's like 800 acres and pretty modern. One developer, it's like Friedman, kind of. I mean, it's, you know, there's some precedent for this, to do it. And then the areas, West Terrace, yeah, we know, but Tangley Oaks, as we did research, as Gwen did research on this, and she's a preservation planner, you know, as we saw, I mean, you're living in a park there. I mean, this was so sensitively and carefully designed that it is, and I don't think anything has really been compromised there that I know of. And maybe the people need to know, you know, about the armor and how it happened and the mansion and all that, and that kudos, you know, for preservation, that it, you know, that you would have an adaptive reuse in your residential community. I mean, that's a great example to people, you know. But also, the planning of this particular subdivision is remarkable. And, you know, having a program on, you know, we've got the research, the program for the residents of Tangley Oaks about why their place is so special. And Armor Woods, too. You know, they're both pretty cool. Public outreach, this is all stuff you know, but, you know, put it on the internet when, you know, when it gets in a form that is, you know, makes sense. There's the cover with Janet's house. Who is it? It's one of her kids, I think, in the front yard. And talk to people. I have a PowerPoint on the property tax freeze, you know, it's there, it's in the can. I mean, if you want me to do that for people, I'm happy to do it. I think I use this as an example because this house was in very bad shape. So bad, and I knew the owner when living there when it was in bad shape. And I drove up, and he and Janet and I were together, and he kind of was embarrassed and didn't want us too close to the house. Well, this was rescued by these two guys from the East Coast who moved here because they loved that house. And it looks, it isn't quite done, but boy, is it spectacular. And, you know, I bet you could maybe get them to open it for something. It's amazing.
The important thing is that the house was saved.
The important thing is the house is
It was
saved.
brought back from death's door,
It was.
and Belforet is part of the original grounds of it. That's where the name comes from.
Beautiful forest.
Beautiful Forest is part of the forest for that estate.
This is spectacular. And, you know, there's so much information on this house. I mean, it's quite remarkable. You do this already, but you might, the Vliet Center does it, but you might also tie in, and we did this with our commission when I was on it, I'm not anymore, but we linked with the Historical Society just to get our name out there so that co-sponsoring stuff like this is.
Just so you know, as part of the 125th anniversary celebration, that's all going to be on here. We're developing an app that'll have, at this point, 9 separate walks or bike tours
Wow.
of different parts of Lake Bluff. Yeah.
We were reading each other's minds.
Yeah.
Wow.
So we've gone past the trolley, and we're going to be driving it off of an iPad or an iPhone.
Oh, that's great.
Bring your walking shoes.
Yep.
I've got walking shoes. Sounds like a plan to me. I love that idea. Remember when Gwen and I went to Detroit, and we went to the Edsel Ford estate, and that was the first time I'd ever seen anything like that, where you could do a tour with your phone.
Yeah.
It was, and so you're doing it? That's fantastic.
So we'll let you know when we have a beta version, which might be in a couple of weeks.
Wow.
For the first walk, and you guys can be some beta testers for it.
Sure.
If that's all right.
Beta pigs.
I didn't
No.
say that.
No, that sounds fun. We'd love to beta
Okay.
test it with you. I'm afraid if we've forgotten anybody, but, you know, this was not a 3.5, because Andrew worked on it too, with us. This is not a 4-man band. I mean, we could not have done this starting with Janet and everybody else. I mean, it really was a collaborative effort, and Glenn, you were fantastic. So, you know, a big thank you, and Steve sat down with us, and Paul shared his, I mean, it worked out really well. And Janet, if you're listening, which I bet you are, thank you. It was wonderful. And there we are. We had a lot of fun on looking at Google to find these great images. You sure have a lot of them, you know, that are up there. But we think Lake Bluff is a pretty fantastic place, and it was our pleasure to work here.
We do too, and thank you for all your work and your recommendations. We do need to put a communication plan together. A lot of your ideas are already, we're working on. Revising the ordinance is something that we've talked about quite a bit, for example. And just having this basic information where we can actually link the survey document to the photographs, which
I
is
loved
always
it.
great.
When you showed us that, that is so fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've got a baseline map that all this will be integrated into, so it fits perfectly. And the fact we have the whole village now covered is great.
Nice.
Can I ask you to be a soothsayer for a minute?
A soothsayer?
A mind reader of the future.
Oh, crystal
So
balls.
25 years from now.
Oh, God, I'll be 120.
Yeah. Yeah, but you'll have been married then for 75 years.
Let's hope.
I think of the terraces, and I think of the West Terrace, which is pretty much as it was developed 50-plus years ago, 60 years ago, 70 years ago. What do you think's going to happen there? Is it going to at some point reach the housing demand will be such that those homes are less attractive down than they are up, and we'll have some other type? Or have you seen anything like that any place in the country? I just wonder, I worry about the integrity of those neighborhoods and what we can do to save the integrity, but what's going to happen with the economic forces that we've seen in other parts of town, the east side of town?
I think it's an advantage that there's a critical mass. That just came to me. It's not like I've thought about this. But I think that that's an advantage. And I'm not even sure why I think so. But, you know, there is something about a sense of place.
It's the cohesiveness of that neighborhood.
Yeah. Whereas a lot of, enter in, because a lot of the areas, where there are tear downs, it's like spotty. But here, there is sort of, it's a neighborhood, and Tangley is a different kind of neighborhood.
So what I was thinking about as you were going through I forget the gentleman's name, who you had all the quotes over on the right side. Frank?
Crane?
Crane?
Jacob Crane?
No, not the planner, the developer.
Friedman.
Friedman. So he had a plan of marketing to a particular demographic, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as we as a village think about choosing Lake Bluff, right, as a place where we want to attract new residents to the village, maybe there's a branding strategy that thinks about the terrace as a unique entity in and of itself, and instead of thinking about marketing individual homes as individual homes, you think of marketing individual homes as a cog in a much bigger picture, a cohesive place, a place that has roots, a place that is more than just your individual home, that actually fits in. Potentially there's a market there, potentially there's a price point there, so that you could get people of like-minded, who are like-minded around preservation, around those kinds of homes, to band together and not save the place, but just live there. And by living there, 25, 50 years from now, we'll have the same general streetscape that we have now. Just the trees will be probably of different type.
Better,
because
bigger.
we'll get
But
more volume.
think about like Buffalo Grove. And that was a planned community. I mean, my husband was a financial consultant to municipalities in a different life. I mean, early in his career. And so I used to go to the village meetings with him, and we're talking 70s, or whenever they started to build out Buffalo Grove. Looks pretty darn good now. I mean, I haven't driven down the streets to see if there have been tear downs. I don't know. But, the trees have filled out, and there is kind of a sense of community,
So just something I know that we think about, and
I think what you're saying makes sense.
as we build out our strategy.
It's as a place to live.
I think there will always be a need for ranch homes.
Microphone. Sorry.
I think there will always be a need for ranch homes, and I think they will always be popular, but what really struck me in the West Terrace is that sense of neighborhood. Like Susan was saying, kids were running around, riding their bikes without adults, which was amazing to me. But also, I think that
Well,
there...
you now know Lake Bluff is ruled by the middle schoolers. I mean, that's who really runs the village.
Well,
The-
at
so
one
there's
point-
nothing,
That's
yeah.
true all over town.
At one point, I was thinking this was like a movie set, that it really was like Pleasantville, and then a group of kids rode by on bikes, and one of them had a balloon, and it was almost like someone said, "Cue the kids." And I mean, it was so picturesque and scenic, it was unbelievable. But I think that a lot of these mid-century buildings are really having a moment now, and there is a house, and I think it's on Thorndale, that was one of the Chicago construction models, but clearly someone took it, updated it so sensitively. It is so contemporary looking now. It is fabulous. They have address numbers that are probably 18 inches by 18 inches, mounted, sideways. They updated the garage door. I think it's orange now. There's lighting, but it clearly, the integrity is still intact.
There's a retro sense
But it's
to that.
updated, and it is, I would move in there in a minute. I know so many people that would love to live in a house like that, and it's a ranch, and there's a sidewalk for your kids to run around on, and there isn't a lot of traffic because it's off of Green Bay. It's relatively quiet. I think that neighborhood has longevity. I think it has a lot of appeal and will have a lot of appeal if you find the right people.
Great.
You
Well,
know-
and that's, actually, I was gonna stop, but if you find the right people, that's actually, so our
Yeah.
branding strategy, our marketing strategy is Choose Like Bluff. And it's actually reaching out to the people who wanna live here and identifying those people and doing the outreach so that the people who appreciate what's here are the people who are attracted to come and look, and providing tools and incentives for those folks to move in,
Right.
who know what they're getting into, who love what they're getting into. That's what we're
Nice.
working towards,
Until the economics get out of whack.
until the economics get on.
Until the value of the land becomes so much higher than the value of the house, that it's you're almost directed to tear the house down,
Yeah.
to build out the property, edge to edge.
So I was, as I was reviewing the survey the last few days, I was thinking along the same lines as Steve, but not so much just about the terraces, but about the village as a whole. You know, again, what I loved about what you did with the survey was kind of the overlay or the juxtaposition between the village planning and the current housing trends of the day, you know, going on in the United States. And just kind of wondering, our village plan is still to preserve the character of the community and the charm, and wondering like what is going on currently with housing trends and what kinds of desires for certain types of housing are going on right now that still fit with our plan to preserve the character and the charm of the town. And like, how do we market to those people to
You know,
get that?
one of the things you could do is, there are distinctive, and we know what they are, distinctive characteristics of the houses and the types of windows, and we know what they all look like historically. So you could do something with the people who live there in terms of, you know, you want to adapt windows or whatever. You know, this is the kind that are appropriate. Or, I'm just winging it, but
Yeah.
that strikes me as something that could be helpful, you know?
You didn't go inside any of these homes. I mean, part of what we hear when we have people who are looking to demolish a house, unfortunately, is that it's just not livable. It doesn't have the kind of open floor plan that we need
Really?
to
'Cause they
raise
had
our family.
open floor plans.
Yeah, so that in the back of my mind that always runs around. I mean,
Move-in ready.
yeah, move in ready, so I don't have to do anything.
Well, that's the focus of the buyer also.
Correct.
Of the buyer who says, I can only buy new. And without being too insulting, maybe this isn't the community to say, I have to buy new. I mean, because everything here is getting old.
Yeah,
Without,
maybe you don't.
You know, when we worked on Fort Sheridan, I was working with Landmarks, Illinois, and we developed overlays. I'm trying to think what to call them, the P sheets. I don't even know what that stands for anymore, preservation probably. But it shows where, and those are pretty big buildings, but everybody wanted to add. So where do you put the family room kind of thing? The kitchens, I mean, you can imagine, these were officers' housing, the kitchens weren't much, so how do you have a nice kitchen? How do you have a nice kitchen in an informal area? Where the master, all the stuff that we all know. So we developed these sheets where this was the construction zone, yeah, sure, add on. you know, and they, you know, it's all the things like the Secretary of the Interior standards. The roofs are a little lower, the back, not so visible from the street area was in that zone. And so it worked. I mean, because all these houses were sold, and then people bought them, and they did do what had to be done, because there was an easement, and they had to do it, if they wanted that
So
stuff.
again, in the spirit of just winging it here, do you know of any municipalities that have identified period-appropriate modifications / additions to historic structures?
Of this era?
Of any era, and what I'm focusing on is, when you said there are lots of homes on the terraces that have built into the back, and you said that's okay, because the
That's okay,
streetscape.
Yeah.
So, you know.
You mean guidelines?
Has anybody been proactive, yeah, and said, look, here's how you can add on to this relatively small
The city of Chicago
home.
had the bungalow initiative,
Right,
and they had
Right.
how to appropriately add on,
Yep.
modify, and enlarge your, that's one example.
That's interesting.
The owners, some of the owners of the terraces were very, very intrigued by the brochure that I had in
The
a
original
notebook.
brochure.
Yes. A couple people said they had it, but most did not.
right.
And the ones who did not said they would love a copy of it. And I said, well, we just got a copy over at the Vliet Center, but what a great marketing thing that would be, to reprint that and give it to the owners. And, or, you know, some of the owners were very interested, they wanted to hear more about it, they wanted to go to the Vliet Center and learn about the neighborhood. That may be a tool, same with Tangley. So,
Adding on to that comment and the earlier comment about Fort Sheridan, you don't see, now that we're sort of at the stage of looking at sort of the second build-out of Fort Sheridan. Fort Sheridan has now been a public community long enough that you now have rolled over the residents once or twice in most of those buildings. You don't see people coming and now hanging yet another addition on those nice old houses or on some of the Army barracks buildings. And the thing that you don't see in the West Terrace, or essentially in any of the terraces, is people hanging great big honking, ugly-looking boxes on the backs of the buildings, or
like
trying
on
to-
some of the bungalows in the
Yeah,
city where
right,
they build
and
up.
some of the things you see in the city, are people
Right.
trying to run complete glass atriums for sunrooms off the backs of their houses, things that you know that are just completely incompatible
Mm-hmm.
with the buildings. We haven't seen that occur.
This is good.
Actually, what we see here is they just come in with a bulldozer and tear the house down, so.
And, yeah,
Bad.
okay, well, that's food for thought, actually, that's opened up.
But
a
it
whole
might be
new-
interesting, you know, talk to like Lisa DiChiaro at Landmarks, Illinois, because she's got her fingers on the pulse of what's going on everywhere in this area. And see if anybody's developed, you know, guidelines like we did for the fort. I mean, that was,
So one of the, rather than make photocopies of the brochure, our online tool, we can attach to the actual site-specific location of the so the idea is that you have a map of Lake Bluff, you have every
that's
housing
even
unit.
better.
And if you're, and we'd like to be able to actually put ones that are for sale on there as well, if the real estate community is interested. But somebody who's interested in Lake Bluff and drives down the street and says, I wonder about that house, you pull up the map, you hit on it, and you get
All of this.
a lot of information, and we could actually put a link or put a PDF that would have the brochure, the original brochure of the house, which would actually, that's really easy to do, that's neat. I like that. You had something, I'm sorry, I keep interrupting.
No, you're right. So just to jump in for a sec, I've been accused from time to time of being a bit, you know, bringing my Kansas City baggage with me when I talk about some of these planning
Do
things.
tell about Kansas City.
Oh,
baggage.
God.
Yes, well, you know,
There's some
they
neat
had.
developments.
You're not referring to what's on the screen?
No,
Okay,
no,
good.
that is just a
checking.
wallpaper.
There's some fun developments in Kansas City.
Oh, Kansas City's beautiful. I was just there.
Yeah, wow.
Fantastic.
So Kansas City, very defined by a ring of first-ring suburbs that are all also post-World War II development immediately after. And I'll circulate this for you. But they had some grants to do precisely what we're talking about. So they have, I'm scrolling.
So you're
Pretty
being
fast.
proactive.
Oh, look at
You're
that.
being proactive and you're
What?
looking at what could be to someone who might be interested. That's
Yeah.
cool.
And it's real nuts and bolts, so we'll go down here to,
Oh,
here's your Cape
the-
Cod.
Here's how to do it, okay?
Here's
That's neat. I
the
like
areas in blue are
Fantastic.
changed.
Okay.
You know, what do you do to the exterior? Some of this is
Geez, window
familiar.
selections, door selections?
How do you put a garage on there when a garage may not have been original to the site?
Uh-huh.
How do you modify your floor plan? It's
Holy
neat stuff.
cow.
So
Now, that would be very attractive to somebody who's looking,
Wow.
looking at a house as a,
It would
as a new place.
be very attractive to see that on our village website, so.
That's fabulous.
And is this,
Available to us.
Yeah,
is this presented as something that's really interesting to think about, or are there zoning and redevelopment teeth behind it? Such as you can develop within this envelope as specified in this brochure, et cetera.
I suppose I would say that in most cases, at least in the suburbs I was familiar with and practiced in Kansas City, their zoning restrictions are not as restrictive
It's
as
the
here.
former,
You
yeah.
would be able to do any of these without great difficulty.
But it's my understanding in Kansas City, they have a very strong preservation planning, their planning department has a very strong
In the city.
In the city
preservation
proper,
Yeah, these are
background
suburbs, yeah.
that stretches out into some of the vast areas surrounding Kansas City. 'Cause
Kansas City-
Kansas City tends to sprawl, doesn't it?
It is very sprawled, and the city limits are very sprawled. I will tell you that I never, I don't think I saw a preservation ordinance in the suburbs when I was out there.
Okay.
I could be mistaken, but I only know it to have
Could you
been
send this
practiced in the
to
city
us?
proper. Certainly.
As well as the link to the detail, the spreadsheet, how many columns spreadsheet?
52?
51 columns spreadsheet?
A thought occurred to me, I guess I should just stay up here because I can't stop talking. But the residents that I talked to in the West Terraces who were so thrilled to live there, some of them were only the second owners of the house. They wouldn't live anywhere else. And they didn't need to live anywhere else. And they didn't want to go anywhere else. And the younger people who were there with their kids felt the same way. And I didn't talk to any owners of tear-downs, but based on what I learned from the people who I did talk to who were there and who were there for the long term, it's the newcomers who are tearing the houses down. The people who have lived there before love it and don't want to make any changes. It's the new people. So I think you're on the right.
That's not surprising.
No, I think you're on the right tack by marketing these houses to new people so that they don't come in and tear them down.
I think you're finding people who say, I want to be in Lake Bluff, but I have to have a new house. I gotta have both slices of the cake. And that's, I think what you see.
I do also, I know this is repetitive and we're going back a few subjects, but I think Lake Bluff has a reputation of enormous charm and like a small town, and I was talking to my hairdresser yesterday, and I was telling her about this, and she said, she lives in McHenry, and she said, oh, I've only heard amazing things about Lake Bluff. She said, I would love to live there, but my parents live out in McHenry, so I have to stay there. But she said, I've heard the houses are so cute, the people are so nice, and they have that amazing 4th of July parade. So people know and love it.
All right, thank you again for your presentation and all your hard work, and I'm sure we'll be asking more questions as we digest. We'll make sure that you see the results of your work as, there'll be some pretty quick results, one of which will be getting it onto the Choose Lake Bluff website, which will happen only when Glenn has enough time. You're not doing anything else in the village.
While you're resting.
Anything else going on?
Yeah, and then the history walk, which is, built a lot, that will start. And one of the history walks we're doing, just to pique your interest, we're doing Dogs on the Bluff as part of the Lake Bluff 125th anniversary celebration. So we have these ceramic, I don't know what they are,
They're
have
plastic, they're fiberglass dogs.
fiberglass dogs that most of the
They're-
downtown
they're like-
businesses
Like
have.
the fiberglass cows?
We have like the cows on parade in Chicago. I think there's 70+ that are gonna be all around town. And we're gonna have all the cows and all the photographs, as well as their name and the owner and the trainer, which is the artist, are gonna be on the app. So if you wanna look at all of them, you just go to the app and you can see all of them all around town and exactly where they are. It's a geo access, so you'll have a map of Lake Bluff and it'll have all the pinpoints that will be where the dogs are.
Here's one.
Yeah, there's a dog.
It was corn roast day in Lake Bluff. so-
Yeah, that's all right.
They don't all come
Corn
with
dog.
corn.
And they'll all have dog tags, and the dog tags will have the name of the dog and the owner and the trainer and all.
Will they be for sale then, Steve, or are they already owned by the
They're owned by
original
the individuals or businesses. Some people are probably going to auction them off afterwards, and the proceeds going into the 125 committee. So it'll be fun. All right, any other comments or questions from the commissioners?
No,
This
but
is a
thank you
great
again. It
report.
was
Thank you very much. This
This
is
is
a
a
great
superb
report,
report.
lots of
Yeah.
work.
Okay.
We've got one more item of work, so leave a few cookies there. I'll take some with me.
Okay.
Thank you.
When can I get a copy of this report that doesn't have draft written across the front of it?
I just put it through your printer that has the red erase feature.
Right,
Yeah.
okay, yeah, okay.
Why?
Um,
This is why. Okay, staff report, I think all we have is the April meeting date.
Certainly, so to frame some things up a little bit more broadly, going back to a report from Chairman Kraus, it's not, I would say also, as a sign of encouragement, it's not just that we're playing with the idea of ordinance revisions. There's a draft. It's not quite ready to circulate, but I would say that we've gone through a couple rounds of revisions and it's getting close. I can say to you genuinely that I hope we've come up with stuff that is actually pretty innovative.
Hopefully.
I've got high hopes, so stay tuned.
Looking forward to that.
So I'm not here on the 8th of April, I'm not here that week. Of course, maybe I will be, because I was gonna be to California, but we'll see. So we may have the ordinance, we may not. We will, what's the status of what we're dealing with Stonebridge is waiting for a discussion, a presentation certainly from the petitioner on financial hardship. And I understand we're not going to have a village analysis of the finances, but we do need to receive that information, right? And are they prepared to do that in April?
We have not had great discussions with them yet, aside from the idea of continuing this in April. What we wanted to do at this time was just to look at some possible dates in April to convene a meeting to continue this. And then also if there are any questions that have occurred to you since that first meeting.
Okay.
Want to gather those and transmit them. That doesn't have to be right here, right now, but certainly
Right.
in the next few days, we'd want to let them know what, if anything, specifically there's questions about from their original presentation.
Okay.
What happened to our financial analysis process?
Certainly. So we did solicit some proposals. They were prohibitively expensive, would be
Okay.
the term I would use. So
Right.
again, in the context of other priorities and also thinking of, that would do a lot, for example, for choosing Lake Bluff.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So I'm comfortable if you want to go ahead and meet on the 8th. It is scheduled, and see if they can do that. I just won't be here, but I could listen to the tape, or if we want to set another meeting.
When will you be here?
I'm just gone that week. I'm gone the 6th through the 10th. I'm here all the rest of the April.
Well, I'm in town the following week,
Yeah, I'm in town the following week as
I'm
well.
in town.
okay?
Are you in town?
You want to try something the week of the 13th?
Yeah, week of the,
Want to put a Google?
Yep, we'll
put a-
give us a chance to check in with our petitioner as well. I know for sure the 13th and I believe the 15th will both be taken.
Sure.
But that Tuesday or that Thursday,
Sure.
Maybe
14th or
we'll put
16th
something
are
together.
fine. Those are both fine. Okay, let's just assume we'll move it, and we'll get some information out. Anything else from the commissioners?
No.
I like the discussion today. I really have to think more about this, which I had not thought about before, as being very proactive on how you can take a 50s ranch and retain what makes it neat, but potentially provide features for a new generation of owners that might be attractive. How in effect to adaptively reuse what's there without destroying what we know and love, and without altering significantly the streetscape. I think that's an interesting challenge, and I like what you sent. I'm looking forward to looking at it.
I wonder how many more examples there are like that around the country.
I don't
Because
know.
I suspect there's quite a
Yeah,
few.
I think that, and
I think I've seen a few. I also think Kansas City wasn't the first, but I think that was one of the earlier examples.
And I think that's an area that is self-contained, that it's pretty much all of the same age range of the generally same type of house. So it lends itself very nicely as a proof of concept to do this, and if that works, we can maybe look at some other things as well.
Sure.
Okay. I also like the idea of thinking of Tangley as I hadn't thought of it as a national register, as a district.
Yeah.
We could easily make it, if we do a district, we could certainly identify it as whatever we're calling it, as the honorific, whatever we're calling the honorific district. We could do something like that.
One of the parameters for National Historic Register district is urban planning.
And that
And
certainly
so
is.
you can say, the architecture itself is one thing, but when you add that to the urban planning, it's the urban planning that really drives the architecture. So this isn't all David Adler fancy moldings and stuff, it's look at how we've developed this 200-acre piece of virgin forest and tried to leave as many trees in place as possible.
The first
So-
public meeting I went to in Lake Bluff was the first presentation at the junior high from the James Group in
Okay.
developing Tangley. in
How
the
was
70s.
that?
It was, as a young guy who had a big mortgage and not much money in his pocket, looking and thinking, how in the heck can anybody afford that house? But it was
You weren't in
fascinating
his target.
from a plan, I was not in the target demographic at all, not the target age either, or the target demographic. But the urban planning component was actually why I went, and that has always been fascinating. Okay.
Yeah, I wish Bob Hunter was here tonight to hear that piece of this.
Yeah.
Because he probably lived through a certain part of that.
Think he's listening?
Well, Bob, I hope you're listening. So.
Anything else?
I would note
One more?
one thing that inspires that I would note while the conversation's fresh is, there have been, I think we're all familiar with the history of the prior historic district proposal, something that makes
Two
Tangley-
prior district proposals.
two prior district proposals, I apologize.
All right?
But something that makes Tangley unique is that between the regulations of the plan residential development and the review that I understand the HOA does to all building permits, not a whole lot changes,
Right.
which is interesting to consider.
Yeah. Okay.
Very good.
Entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Anyone opposed? We're adjourned. Thank you again very much for your presentation and for all your hard work.